In the autumn of 1941, the United States Navy was a study in contradiction, an institution caught between a storied past and an uncertain future. It possessed a powerful fleet, but one conceived for a different kind of war, shackled by the naval limitation treaties of the 1920s and 30s. Its battle line, the pride of the fleet, consisted of aging battleships, some of which had fired their guns in the First World War, slumbering at their moorings in the placid waters of Pearl Harbor. The air arm, while growing, was still seen by many traditionalists as a subordinate force, a tool for scouting and spotting for the all-important capital ships. The primary carrier-borne fighter was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a rugged but stubby aircraft that was already being eclipsed in performance by its most likely adversary, the elegant and lethally agile Mitsubishi A6M0. The standard torpedo bomber, the Douglas TBD Devastator, was a slow, vulnerable relic, its design dating back to the mid-1930s. The entire strategic doctrine of the United States Pacific Fleet was predicated on Plan Orange, a decades-old concept for a methodical island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, culminating in a decisive fleet action against the Japanese Navy somewhere near the Philippines, a Mahanian fantasy of dreadnoughts clashing in formation. A detailed inventory of assets on the eve of conflict revealed both latent strength and alarming deficiencies. The Navy possessed 7 fleet carriers of the Yorktown and earlier classes, with the revolutionary new Essex-class vessels still years from reaching the fleet in numbers. These carriers operated roughly 24 carrier-based squadrons, equipped with a mixed bag of aircraft. Alongside the soon-to-be outclassed Wildcats and Devastators were the formidable Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, slow but precise and durable, perhaps the single most effective naval aircraft in the world at that precise moment. The submarine force was large, but it was armed with the disastrous Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon so plagued with defects in its depth control and magnetic detonator that it would render the silent service nearly impotent for the first year and a half of the war. On the surface, the fleet's anti-aircraft firepower was dangerously inadequate, relying on a combination of heavy 5-inch guns ill-suited for engaging modern high-speed aircraft, and a pittance of 50-caliber machine guns and 11-inch automatic cannons, the latter being a notoriously unreliable weapon derisively nicknamed the Chicago Piano. New weapons, like the 20mm Oerlikon and 40mm Bofors cannons, were only just beginning to be produced and had not yet been fitted to the majority of ships. This was a force built on potential, possessing the industrial and human raw material for greatness, but in its current state it was brittle. A comparative analysis against the Imperial Japanese Navy of 1941 was sobering. Japan possessed 10 carriers, including the world's largest, the Kaga and Akagi. Its naval air corps, the Kido Butai, was without peer. Its pilots were the most experienced in the world, hardened by years of combat in China. They flew superior aircraft, chief among them the Zero, which could outclimb, outturn, and outrange any American fighter. Japanese naval optics were superb, and their skill in night combat was legendary, honed through relentless and realistic training. Their long lance torpedo was the finest naval weapon of its kind in the world, far more reliable, faster, and longer-ranged than its American counterpart. Where the United States held an advantage was in its nascent radar technology, with early sets like the CXAM installed on some capital ships, a technology the Japanese fatally underestimated. The most significant American advantage, however, was not a piece of hardware but an abstract concept: its immense, and as yet untapped, industrial potential. While Japan's industry was already operating at near-peak capacity to support its military ambitions, the American industrial behemoth was still largely dormant, producing automobiles and refrigerators. The question was whether this potential could be mobilized in time to avert disaster. The seeds of future American dominance were, however, already being sown, hidden within naval appropriations bills and design bureaus. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, a direct response to the fall of France, had authorized a staggering expansion of the fleet, including 18 new fleet carriers, 7 battleships, and scores of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. On the drawing boards at the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, was a successor to the Wildcat, a new design designated the F-6F Hellcat, which deliberately sacrificed agility for overwhelming power, armor, and ease of production. In naval research laboratories, scientists were experimenting with revolutionary concepts, including proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells that would allow them to detonate near a target without a direct hit, and advanced fire control computers that could calculate aiming solutions for multiple guns against fast-moving aerial targets. The organizational concept of the Carrier Task Force was being refined, shifting the focus of naval power from the gun to the airplane. A vast pilot training program was being established, designed to produce tens of thousands of naval aviators. This future Navy, a force of unparalleled technological sophistication and material abundance, was on order, but in the final months of 1941, it was still just a promise, a series of blueprints and production schedules. The existing fleet would have to hold the line. The geopolitical shock that transformed American potential into kinetic reality occurred at 7:55 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1941. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical masterpiece for Japan, but it was a strategic catastrophe of the highest order. In the space of 2 hours, the backbone of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battle line was broken, with 4 battleships sunk and 4 others damaged. The attack accomplished something that years of internal debate could not. It rendered the battleship-centric naval doctrine obsolete overnight. With the battle wagons gone, the aircraft carriers, which had been providentially at sea on training exercises and ferry missions, were no longer a supporting arm. They were the only arm. The sinking of the British capital ships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse by Japanese air power just 3 days later merely confirmed the new reality. The age of the dreadnought was over, and the age of the carrier had begun, not through a process of deliberate doctrinal evolution, but through the violent crucible of combat. The high-level response from Washington was immediate and immense in scale.
President Franklin D.
Roosevelt, addressing a joint session of Congress, famously declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy. But beyond the rhetoric, his administration unleashed the full might of the American government and economy. The goals set were astronomical, almost fantastical. In a 1942 address, the president called for the production of 60,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, and 8 million deadweight tons of shipping in that year alone, figures that dwarfed the total output of all the Axis powers combined. For the Navy, the Two-Ocean Navy Act became the floor, not the ceiling. Shipyards were ordered to work around the clock, 7 days a week. The national priority shifted from civilian consumption to military production with a totality that was breathtaking. The entire economic and social fabric of the nation was reoriented toward a single purpose: the prosecution of a global war. To manage this unprecedented mobilization, a sprawling alphabet soup of new bureaucratic organizations was created. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, was given supreme authority over the national economy, with the power to halt all civilian automobile production, ration vital materials like steel, copper, and rubber, and direct entire industries to convert to military manufacturing. The Office of Scientific Research and Development, under the leadership of Vannevar Bush, was tasked with mobilizing the nation's scientific and academic talent, initiating massive, secret projects like the Manhattan Project and the development of the proximity fuse. The War Shipping Administration took control of all American merchant shipping, while the National War Labor Board was established to mediate disputes between labor and management, ensuring that strikes and lockouts did not impede the torrent of production. This vast, complex, and often overlapping network of committees, boards, and administrations was the organizational engine that would translate presidential directives and congressional appropriations into a flood of warships, aircraft, and munitions that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis. It was a messy, inefficient, and quintessentially American response, but its sheer scale and energy were unstoppable. The industrial expansion required to meet these goals defied all precedent. Shipyards that had been quiet for years roared back to life, and new ones were built from scratch on what had been empty mudflats.
Henri J.
Kaiser, a construction magnate with no prior shipbuilding experience, applied mass production techniques to the building of Liberty ships, eventually reducing the construction time for a 10,000-ton vessel from months to mere weeks, with one ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, being built in an astonishing 4 days and 15 hours. The same principles were applied to warships. Prefabrication and modular construction became standard. Entire sections of a destroyer's hull or an aircraft carrier's island superstructure would be built in workshops miles from the slipway, then transported and welded into place. The Navy's own shipyards, like the New York Naval Shipyard and the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, expanded dramatically, while private yards like Newport News Shipbuilding and the Electric Boat Company went on a war footing. The Ford Motor Company's massive Willow Run plant, a mile-long factory built on farmland in Michigan, was converted to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, at its peak rolling one bomber off the assembly line every hour. This industrial avalanche was not just about building new things. It was about a fundamental transformation in the philosophy of manufacturing, applying the principles of consumer mass production to the instruments of war. At the heart of this transformation was an explosion in technological development, most critically in the field of naval aviation. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was the ultimate expression of the new American design philosophy. Learning the lessons of early encounters with the Zero, Grumman's engineers, led by Leroy Grumman himself, did not try to build a more agile fighter. Instead, they built a survivor. The Hellcat was powered by a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the same engine that powered the Vought F-4U Corsair and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was heavily armed with 650 caliber machine guns, and it was armored like a flying tank with a bullet-resistant windscreen and extensive plating around the cockpit, engine, and oil cooler. It was faster than the Zero at most altitudes, could outdive it dramatically, and possessed a phenomenal rate of roll. While it could not outturn a Zero in a low-speed dogfight, its pilots were taught to use its strengths, to make high-speed diving attacks and then use its power to climb away, a tactic known as boom and zoom. Crucially, it was designed for mass production and was forgiving to fly, a vital trait for the thousands of rookie pilots being churned out by stateside training commands. The Grumman Iron Works delivered over 12,000 Hellcats during the war, and they would be credited with destroying over 5,000 enemy aircraft, achieving a kill-to-loss ratio against the Japanese of more than 19-1. The dive bomber and torpedo bomber also underwent a critical evolution. The Douglas SBD Dauntless, the hero of Midway, was slowly replaced by the much larger, faster, and more complex Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. The Helldiver's development was deeply troubled. It was overweight, unstable, and plagued by structural failures, earning it the pejorative nickname the Beast or Son of a Bitch Second Class from its crews. It required over 800 engineering changes before it was considered combat-ready. However, once the bugs were worked out, it was a formidable weapon, capable of carrying a 2,000-pound bomb or a torpedo in its internal bay, giving it far more punch than the Dauntless. It was a difficult and unforgiving aircraft to fly, but its speed and payload made it a key component of the fleet's striking power in the war's later stages. The replacement for the TBD Devastator was the Grumman TBF Avenger, later also produced by General Motors as the TBM. The Avenger was a huge, slab-sided aircraft, but it was exceptionally stable, durable, and versatile. It carried a crew of 3, was armed with defensive machine guns in a power-operated turret and a ventral position, and could carry a 2,000-pound torpedo or a variety of bomb loads. Its combat debut at the Battle of Midway was a disaster, with 5 of the first 6 aircraft lost without scoring a hit, but this was due to a lack of fighter escort, not a flaw in the aircraft itself. In time, the Avenger would prove to be one of the war's most effective and reliable weapons platforms. Parallel to the advances in aircraft were revolutionary developments in electronics and ordnance that created a defensive shield around the fleet of unprecedented effectiveness. The first of these was radar. By 1943, American warships were being equipped with a suite of sophisticated radar sets. The SK Air Search Radar could detect incoming enemy formations at ranges of up to 100 miles, providing crucial early warning. The SG Surface Search Radar could detect ships and even periscope feathers in total darkness or fog, robbing the Japanese of their traditional advantage in night combat. This information was fed into a new space within the ship, the Combat Information Center, or CIC. The CIC was the ship's electronic nerve center, a darkened room where radar plots were tracked on transparent boards, radio communications were managed, and a clear, real-time picture of the tactical situation was developed. From the CIC, fighter directors could vector friendly fighters to intercept incoming raids long before they ever saw the fleet. This ability to see over the horizon, to manage a complex air battle with precision, was a capability the Japanese never developed. The second component of this shield was the VT, or Variable Time, Fuse. Developed in secrecy at the Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, the proximity fuse was a miniature marvel of ruggedized electronics. It was essentially a tiny radio transceiver packed into the nose of an anti-aircraft shell. As the shell flew, it broadcast a continuous radio wave. When it passed close to an aircraft, the reflected signal would be detected by the fuse, which would then trigger the detonation of the shell's explosive charge. This eliminated the need for a direct hit or a precisely timed fuse setting. A near miss was now a kill. When first deployed with the fleet in early 1943, its effect was staggering. Gunners on ships watched in amazement as their first salvos, fired at long range, would erupt into black puffs of flak that would simply shred the lead aircraft of an attacking Japanese formation. The Japanese, unaware of the technology, initially believed the Americans had developed a supernatural ability to aim their guns. Official Navy analysis concluded that the VT fuse was at least 3 times more effective than conventional time-fused ammunition, and it was arguably one of the most important technological innovations of the war, turning every 5-inch gun in the fleet into a lethal aircraft killer. These technological leaps were paired with dramatic improvements in conventional gunnery. The new Essex-class carriers and Iowa-class battleships were built with a dual-purpose 5-inch/38 caliber gun as their primary heavy anti-aircraft weapon. These guns were controlled by the Mark 37 gun fire control system. High in the ship's superstructure, a director containing optical sights and a radar antenna would track the target. Below decks, in a plotting room, the Mark I fire control computer, a 3,000-pound electromechanical analog computer, would receive the tracking data. It automatically calculated the target speed, altitude, and bearing, factored in the ship's own course and speed, wind velocity, and even the force of gravity and the spin of the Earth, and then produced a continuous, real-time firing solution that was transmitted electrically to the gun mounts, which would automatically train and elevate to the correct position. The gun crews simply had to load the ammunition. For close-in defense, the unreliable 11-inch guns were replaced by a profusion of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons. A typical Essex-class carrier by 1944 might carry 12 5-inch guns, over 70 40mm guns in quad and twin mounts, and more than 50 20mm cannons, all creating a layered, overlapping wall of computer-directed and radar-fused firepower. This rapid and massive expansion was not without its problems. The pressure to innovate and produce on such a scale inevitably led to growing pains. The Mark 14 torpedo scandal was a prime example. A failure of institutional arrogance and inadequate testing that cost the lives of many submariners and wasted countless opportunities in the first year of the war. It was only after frustrated submarine commanders conducted their own unauthorized field tests, proving the weapon's flaws, that the Bureau of Ordnance was forced to correct the problems. The SB-2C Helldiver represented another kind of problem. A new weapon rushed into production before it was ready, requiring extensive and costly post-delivery modifications. Inter-service rivalry also hampered coordination, particularly between the Navy and the Army Air Forces in the Pacific, with commanders like General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz commanding separate theaters with often conflicting priorities and resources. The logistical challenge of supplying this enormous new fleet across 6,000 miles of ocean was perhaps the greatest hurdle of all. It necessitated the creation of a massive fleet train of oilers, ammunition ships, and replenishment vessels, a mobile logistics base that could sustain the combat fleet at sea for months at a time, a feat of organization unprecedented in naval history. The influx of new technology and the lessons of early battles forced a radical evolution in naval doctrine. The centerpiece of this new doctrine was the Fast Carrier Task Force, which in the Pacific was designated either Task Force 58 or Task Force 38, depending on whether it was commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance or Admiral Mark Mitcher. This was not simply a collection of ships. It was an integrated weapon system of immense power and flexibility. A typical task force in 1944 consisted of 4 task groups, each built around 2 to 4 fleet carriers and 1 or 2 light carriers. These 15 or 16 carriers would operate over 1,000 aircraft. Screening this aerial armada was a protective shell of new fast battleships, cruisers, and a swarm of destroyers. The battleships, like the magnificent Iowa class, now served not as the primary offensive arm, but as floating anti-aircraft platforms, their main batteries used for shore bombardment, while their dozens of 5-inch, 40mm, and 20mm guns provided a formidable defense for the precious carriers. The entire formation was designed for mutual support, capable of projecting overwhelming air power against a target and then defending itself against the inevitable counterattack with its interlocking web of fighter patrols and shipboard anti-aircraft fire, all coordinated from the CICs of the flagship and its escorts. By mid-1943, this new Navy was beginning to make its presence felt in the Pacific. For the thousands of young pilots, fresh from training centers in Florida and Texas, the war was an intensely personal experience of long patrols over an endless, featureless expanse of blue water. A typical day for a Hellcat pilot on the new USS Essex or USS Intrepid began long before dawn. The view from the cockpit was a mixture of the mundane and the terrifying. There was the gut-wrenching tension of a catapult shot, being accelerated from 0 to over 100 miles per hour in the space of a few seconds. There was the constant, wearying task of navigation, relying on rudimentary radio homing beacons and dead reckoning. The weather was as much an enemy as the Japanese, with sudden squalls that could scatter a formation and make returning to the carrier a life-or-death gamble. Combat, when it came, was a blur of frantic action, moments of sheer terror punctuated by long periods of boredom. For these young men, the war was not about grand strategy. It was about finding their carrier in a storm, trusting the instruments on their panel, and hoping their engine didn't fail hundreds of miles from home. The anecdotal evidence from these early deployments of the new equipment validated the design philosophies back home. A Hellcat pilot, returning from a sweep over a Japanese-held island, might have his plane riddled with 77mm machine gun fire, but the armor plate behind his seat and the self-sealing fuel tanks would allow him to make it back to the carrier, a feat that would have been impossible in a lightly built Zero. His laconic report would be added to a growing body of evidence. The new fighter was tough. An Avenger crew on anti-submarine patrol might spend 8 grueling hours in the air, a testament to the reliability of their Wright Cyclone engine. A destroyer on picket duty, 50 miles ahead of the main fleet, would report a bogey on its SK radar, a contact at 80 miles. Minutes later, the fleet's fighter director would coolly order a division of Hellcats to a specific vector and altitude, and the pilots, still miles from the enemy, would climb on command, trusting the unseen voice on the radio. These small, daily occurrences were the building blocks of victory, proving that the system of technology, training, and doctrine was working. This period also starkly illustrated the inexperience of the new American crews, but also their remarkable ability to adapt. These were not the hardened veterans of the pre-war Navy or the desperate survivors of 1942. They were civilians in uniform. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, all thrust into the most complex technological environment on Earth. They made mistakes. They got lost. They damaged aircraft in clumsy landings. A famous story circulated about a young helldiver pilot who, upon returning to his carrier, was so focused on his approach that he failed to lower his landing gear. The landing signal officer, frantically waving him off, watched in horror as the pilot interpreted his signals as encouragement, giving him a cheerful thumbs up just before crashing onto the deck. Yet, this same inexperience was coupled with an aggressive spirit and a deep-seated confidence in their equipment. They learned their trade on the job in the unforgiving classroom of combat, and their sheer numbers meant that losses, while tragic, were sustainable. This was a luxury the Japanese, whose irreplaceable cadre of veteran pilots was being steadily ground down, could not afford. The American learning curve was steep, but it was upward, while the Japanese curve was tragically headed in the opposite direction. The ultimate trial by fire for this transformed American naval force, the decisive confrontation that would vindicate its new technology and doctrine, came in June of 1944. The American invasion of Saipan in the Mariana Islands was a dagger pointed at the heart of the Japanese Empire. From airfields on Saipan, new long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers could strike the Japanese home islands. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was an existential threat that had to be met. They sortied their entire remaining carrier force, the mobile fleet, under the command of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, to intercept the American invasion fleet and force a decisive battle. Ozawa's plan, named Ego, was clever. His aircraft had a greater range than their American counterparts, and he planned to use this advantage to strike the American fleet from a distance, rearm and refuel on the island of Guam, and then strike again as they returned to their carriers. a shuttle bombing tactic. He was confident that his pilots, while less experienced than their predecessors, could inflict crippling losses on the Americans. On the American side, Task Force 58, under the overall tactical command of Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard his flagship, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, assembled to meet the threat. The force was the most powerful naval armada the world had ever seen, comprising 15 carriers, 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers, operating nearly 900 aircraft. There was tension on the American command bridge. The aggressive carrier Admiral Mark Mitcher, whose flagship was the USS Lexington, wanted to steam west to find and attack the Japanese carriers at the earliest opportunity. Spruance, a more deliberate and cautious commander, overruled him. His primary mission was to protect the invasion fleet at Saipan. He would not be lured away on a chase. He would let the Japanese come to him, confident that his fleet's defensive systems could break their attack and then deliver a devastating counterpunch. He ordered his ships to take up a defensive posture, forming a massive circular screen of anti-aircraft firepower, and waited. His decision was controversial, but it was born of a cold, clear-eyed assessment of his mission priorities. The battle began on the morning of June 19th. Just after 10 a.m., radar operators on the picket destroyers and on the flagships detected the first of Ozawa's massive raids, a wave of 69 aircraft, approaching from the west at a range of over 150 miles. In the CIC of the Lexington, the air was thick with controlled tension. Plotters marked the incoming raid's course on the plexiglass boards. The fighter director, Commander Joseph "Joe" Eggert, began his work. Calmly, precisely, he vectored squadron after squadron of Hellcats to intercept points miles out from the fleet. Over 450 Hellcats were in the air or being launched. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The inexperienced Japanese pilots, flying inferior aircraft, were met by a wall of American fighters. One Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Commander Charles W. Brewer, leading a division from the USS Essex, later reported that the sky ahead of them was simply full of Zeeks and Judas the Hellcats, using their superior speed and firepower, dove through the Japanese formations, guns blazing. Those few Japanese planes that managed to break through the fighter screen were then met by the second layer of defense, the VT-fused shells of the fleet's 5-inch guns, which tore them from the sky. A second Japanese raid of 128 aircraft was met with the same fate. A third of 47 aircraft and a fourth of 82 aircraft were similarly annihilated. The radio circuits of the American fighters were filled with triumphant, almost disbelieving chatter. One pilot was famously heard to exclaim, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot. The name stuck." By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft and 2 of their carriers had been sunk by American submarines, the Taiho and Shokaku. American losses were minuscule in comparison. Just 30 aircraft and minor damage to a handful of ships. The sensory experience for the participants was overwhelming. For the American pilots, it was a chaotic ballet of diving, climbing, and firing, the brilliant red meatballs of the Japanese insignia flashing in their gun sights for a moment before dissolving into flame and smoke. For the gunners on the ships below, the sky was filled with the black puffs of flak and the fiery trails of falling wreckage. For one young gunner on the battleship USS South Dakota, watching a Japanese dive bomber disintegrate in midair under the combined fire of a dozen guns, the thought that crossed his mind was not one of triumph, but of awe at the sheer, impersonal destructive power he was helping to unleash. The fog of war was a tangible presence throughout the battle. Ozawa, hundreds of miles to the west, received wildly inflated and inaccurate reports from his surviving pilots, leading him to believe he had inflicted heavy damage on the American fleet. He did not realize the true scale of his losses until it was far too late. On the American side, Spruance's decision not to turn west and pursue the fleeing Japanese fleet on the evening of the 19th became one of the most debated actions of the war. He was heavily criticized for allowing the remnants of Ozawa's fleet to escape. His reasoning, however, was sound. He still did not have a precise location for Ozawa's ships, and he feared a night surface action, a type of engagement in which the Japanese had historically excelled. His primary mission, protecting the Saipan landings, was still paramount. It was only on the afternoon of the next day, June 20th, that a search plane finally located the retreating Japanese fleet. Admiral Mitcher, knowing it was late in the day and his planes would have to return in darkness, made a fateful decision. He ordered a massive strike of 216 aircraft launched at extreme range. The attack was successful, sinking another carrier, the Hyo, and damaging others, but as the American planes returned, fuel running low, night fell. The recovery of those aircraft became one of the epic dramas of the Pacific War. The returning pilots faced the terrifying prospect of finding their specific carriers in the vast, dark expanse of the ocean. Seeing their plight, Mitcher made another momentous decision, one that risked revealing his fleet's position to any lurking Japanese submarines. He gave the order, "Turn on the lights," across the task force. Flight decks were illuminated, searchlights were pointed into the sky to serve as beacons, and destroyers fired star shells. The scene was one of controlled chaos, as desperate pilots, some with battle damage, others running on fumes, searched for any available flight deck. Many aircraft ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the sea. Despite the confusion and the loss of some 80 aircraft in operational accidents, the vast majority of the aircrews were rescued from the warm Pacific waters by the fleet's destroyers and cruisers over the next few days. Mitcher's gamble had paid off, saving the lives of hundreds of his men. His decision, a triumph of human compassion over tactical rigidity, cemented his legend among his aviators. In the immediate aftermath, the scale of the victory became clear. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the death knell of Japanese naval aviation. In 2 days, the Kito Butai had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. It had lost 3 of its best carriers and nearly 500 carrier aircraft, an entire generation of its remaining aircrews wiped out. The jubilation aboard the ships of Task Force 58 was immense, tempered only by the exhaustion of combat and the anxiety of the night recovery. The pilots, returning to their ready rooms, shared stories of the turkey shoot, their initial adrenaline giving way to a profound understanding of what had just happened. They had not just won a battle, they had participated in the systematic destruction of an entire enemy air force, a victory made possible not just by their own courage, but by the superior machines they flew and the intricate system that had guided them. A cold, tactical evaluation of the battle reveals a victory rooted in systemic superiority. The contest between the F-6F Hellcat and the later models of the A-6M0 was no contest at all. The Hellcat was faster, more heavily armed, and could absorb immense punishment. The Zero, while still agile, was fragile and underpowered by 1944 standards. The disparity in pilot training was just as stark. The American pilots were the product of a 2-year, highly organized training pipeline that gave them over 300 hours of flight time before they ever saw combat. The Japanese pilots of 1944 were rushed to the front with less than 100 hours, lacking the skills and tactical acumen of their predecessors. The technological advantage was decisive. The American fleet's ability to detect the Japanese raids at long range via radar and to vector its overwhelming fighter force to intercept was something the Japanese simply could not counter. And for the few who broke through, the VT fuse transformed anti-aircraft fire from a deterrent into a truly lethal weapon. The battle was a validation of every major American investment in naval warfare since 1942. Official sources confirm this lopsided reality. In his after-action report, Admiral Mitcher noted the professional skill and gallantry of his pilots. But the statistics told the real story. He reported the confirmed destruction of 395 enemy carrier aircraft in the air and a further 36 on the ground on Guam, against the loss of only 23 of his own pilots in air-to-air combat. The commander of one of the Hellcat squadrons from the USS Hornet wrote, "The primary impression of the day's fighting was the apparent lack of training of the Japanese pilots engaged. Their attacks were not well coordinated and their evasive action after being attacked was of the poorest sort. This stood in stark contrast to the reports from 1942, which spoke with respect and fear of the skill of Japanese naval aviators. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the final, brutal examination in a long course of study, and the Japanese Navy had failed every part of the test. The American system of production, training, and technology had created a force that was qualitatively and quantitatively superior in every measurable dimension. In synthesizing the events of the Pacific War up to that point, The grand summary is one of stunning transformation. The United States Navy of mid-1944 bore little resemblance to the institution of December 1941. The handful of pre-war carriers had been replaced by a fleet of over a dozen fast carriers of the Essex class, with more joining the fleet every month. The vulnerable Devastator and outmatched Wildcat had been replaced by the potent Avenger and the dominant Hellcat. A ship's defense, once reliant on a few machine guns, was now a multi-layered, computer-directed, radar-guided system of destruction. The entire logistical and operational doctrine had been reinvented to support continuous combat operations thousands of miles from the nearest friendly base. In 1941, the United States had produced just under 3,000 military aircraft. In 1944, it produced over 96,000. This was the material manifestation of the arsenal of democracy, an industrial tidal wave that had not just matched but had completely submerged its adversary's capacity to wage war. The comparative outcome following the Philippine Sea was clear and irreversible. While the Japanese still possessed a powerful surface fleet of battleships and cruisers, its naval air arm, the weapon that had brought it such stunning victories in 1941 and 1942, was gone. The subsequent Battle of Leyte Gulf would see Japanese carriers used merely as bait, with almost no aircraft to fly from them. The war's final, desperate phase would be characterized by the kamikaze, a tactic born of the realization that conventional air attacks against the American fleet were no longer possible. The American naval force, by contrast, had reached a level of power and proficiency that was unmatched. It had surpassed its rival not just in numbers, but in the integration of technology, the quality of its personnel, and the sophistication of its doctrine. Luck had played its part, particularly in the survival of the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, but the final outcome was determined less by fortune and more by the systematic application of overwhelming industrial and organizational power. The reduction of Japan's naval empire to rubble was therefore not merely the result of superior firepower in the narrow sense of bigger guns or faster planes. It was the triumph of a superior system. It was a victory of the production line as much as the battle line, of the research laboratory as much as the ready room. The war in the Pacific demonstrated that modern, industrialized warfare was a contest between entire societies and the American system, a system that could design, build, and deploy a weapon like the Hellcat, invent the proximity fuse, organize a logistical train across an ocean, and train tens of thousands of ordinary citizens to operate these complex systems under fire, was ultimately more resilient, more adaptable, and more powerful. The fires that consumed the Japanese fleet at Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf were lit in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Virginia, and the factories of Michigan, a testament to a nation's ability to transform its latent potential into a decisive and overwhelming instrument of war.